This is the More to the Story podcast with Dr. Andy Miller.
We hope you guys enjoyed today's conversation.
Hey, I am so glad you've come along to the More to the Story podcast. We have been going at this for almost a year now. We're coming up on our 52nd episode in just about a month. So there's a lot going on, and our appreciation of so many people who've come alongside this podcast in this time. Now, today is St. Patrick's Day when this comes out, and I thought it would be a great time for us to think about, should we celebrate St. Patrick's Day or not? So right within the offices at Wesley Biblical Seminary is a St. Patrick scholar, believe it or not. There is such a thing. Jeff Bakos, who is a registrar and IT director, and amongst many other things that you do.
Yeah.
And he's working on a dissertation on St. Patrick. So Jeff,
I am.
welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Appreciate being here.
I want to make sure just to highlight, too, we have a few sponsors who've made this podcast happen. WPO Development, also in Bill Roberts Financial Planning. Our thanks to those folks. You can find their information in our show notes and other things like a whole backlog of podcasts that we've had for some time. But Jeff, here's the thing. Like, as we get going, St. Patrick's Day, I mean, some people might just see this as a time to, get drunk or something like that. Why would we even want to celebrate? So how did you come to study St. Patrick?
Yeah, that's it's kind of an interesting journey. I've always loved theology. I was a biblical literature major at Indiana Wesleyan, but I loved theology, and I was really interested in historical theology.
Yeah.
Less systematic, more historical, and I loved Celtic Christianity. It was interesting. I found an author named Stephen Lawhead, who wrote a bunch of great historical Celtic books.
I know, we've never talked about this. The Endless Knot and all those things. Like, what's that series called?
That I can't remember what that.
Hand?
The Silver Hand. Yes, the Silver Hand, Endless Knot. There's
Paradise
another one.
War.
Paradise War.
Yeah.
In the region of the Summer Stars. But he wrote one in particular called it's Robin Hood, basically.
Okay,
it's a story of Robin Hood. It's called, the trilogy is Hood, Scarlet, and Tuck.
Okay.
And he basically took the idea of, what if Robin Hood was an actual historical character?
Interesting.
Let's put him in history. Let's plop him down. About 1066, the Norman invasion. And so the idea is, let's move him from Britain to Wales.
Okay, interesting.
And so he recreates the story of Robin Hood in a way that puts him in Wales around the Norman invasion. And so he's fighting for his homeland.
Okay, interesting.
So it's a really interesting series. And so that got me started, I guess, down this path of discovering what Celtic Christianity is. And through that study, there's a lot of myth around what is Celtic Christianity, and that's kind of a misnomer, because Celtic Christianity is Christianity.
Yeah, sure.
There's no real distinction, but like it's Orthodox Christianity. Like there's nothing.
Right.
There's nothing more. I mean. People say, "Oh, it's this distinct flavor." Yes, there are always distinct flavors in different regions of the world, but there's nothing really mystical about this.
And any country has its version. It has its like cultural appropriations.
Absolutely, and so that really got me started. And so I was in search of a PhD program after I graduated from Wesley Biblical Seminary.
There you go. Yeah.
After I graduated here, I wanted to do something in historical theology. I wanted to do something in Celtic, what I thought that time was distinctly Celtic Christianity.
Right. Yeah.
And so I found University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and discovered my advisor, who was an expert in Celtic hagiography.
Okay.
And so from there, I discovered that no one had really done any sort of theological work on the life of St. Patrick, which was written in around 660 to late to 700.
So let me interrupt you real quick. Because like what you're saying, nobody's done work on the life of St. Patrick. People might not realize that you're actually talking about the title of a book.
Yes.
Yeah. So people have done it, but you're saying that nobody had actually looked at the theological assumptions, the historical accuracy, or what's assumed by the hagiography of the book, The Life of St. Patrick.
Yes. So I'm studying St. Patrick kind of secondhand, if you will. So I'm studying a Life of St. Patrick, was written by an author named Muraku between the most accurate date is 760 to 800. No, 660 to 700.
Okay.
We know we can date it within that
That
range.
biography,
That
not
biography.
St. Patrick himself.
So not St. Patrick himself, but what is interesting is that we have firsthand accounts from St. Patrick.
Okay, interesting.
And so we have two writings from him, the letters to the soldiers of Caradicus, and then a confession of St. Patrick, which is it's a defense of his ministry and life, basically.
Okay.
And so my author based almost the
The
first
one in the 700s.
the one in the 700 600s 7th century.
Gotcha, 7th century. Okay.
7th century, 600s. He based a lot, almost the first third are based on the confession.
Gotcha.
And so in doing research, you have to read the confession if you want to understand what my author was trying to convey. So
Gotcha.
they play off each other. My author expands a little bit. He brings in some biblical allusions that are really interesting. There's a lot of Mosaic allusions, and St. Patrick himself saw himself as almost a Mosaic figure, bringing
Interesting.
Christianity to Ireland. My author expands upon that and brings in, just as Moses did in the desert, things like that.
Yeah,
the
sure,
strong allusions to correlate what Patrick is doing with almost a mosaic figure.
Gotcha.
So I'm studying St. Patrick through the lens of Muraku, through the lens of his hagiography.
Interesting.
Yes.
So hagiography is this idea. Why don't you explain what hagiography is?
So hagiography, the best way I can explain it, it is biography that is fantastic.
Interesting.
It wasn't meant to be read historically.
Yeah.
That's not its purpose. It's more. Now I want to be careful here because we can get into a little bit of sticky situation. It's meant to be read more theological. There are historical underpinnings, and Muraku says that he's writing on the traditions passed down by his fathers.
Right.
Passed down through holy men who have preserved the memory of St. Patrick. And my text is really unique, like I said, because he has a firsthand account. He has Patrick's own writings to go off of, but only for the first half of the book.
Right.
Really the first third of the book. The rest of the book is tradition that had been handed down. And so hagiography it's a fantastic biography. And so we have very early hagiographical accounts of lives of saints. So Athanasius wrote the life of St. Anthony. We have the life of St. Martin that is very early. So we have a very early tradition of the Desert Fathers and other. And so he's very much in a stream of
Hagiographic literature.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is really important because some people might already be pushing back to this because it calls into question historical reality in general.
Yes.
So you say, so now you're saying that St. Patrick didn't exist, or you can say none of this is real. You're just kind of couldn't you just do that with the resurrection? Oh, the resurrection didn't happen. I know we won't get into that here.
Yeah.
But we're talking about something very different and a different set of historical data that we're working with the resurrection. And sometimes the word you're talking about a very specific type of literature.
Yes.
Some people within historical studies often will talk about hagiography and the problems of hagiography. Like, for instance, in my study of William Booth, there are hagiographic elements to the reporting of his life. And so there'll be biographies that are written that are all positive. Like, there's not one negative thing about nothing like really showing the real color of his life. So that's not hagiography in the tradition of what you're talking about, of like what happened to St. Pat, but there are hagiographic aspects.
Yes.
And I'll give you just one example, like from William Booth's life. Like there's this one of the most famous scenes that happens is that before he dies, supposedly, he has this speech that is emblazoned in bronze on most Salvation Army buildings. It says, I'll fight to the very end while women weep as they do now, I'll fight. So the reason I say that is it's likely that didn't happen, that he actually didn't say that. Now, is it something that he would have said? Is it in the spirit of him? Absolutely. Can I take inspiration from that? But did he actually, a couple of days before he died, go up and give this speech? Probably not.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. And where we get, I mean, this is where we get the term, oh, that's hagiographical. When we say that, we are meaning that it's a fantastic element.
Okay.
And so, but I also want to be careful to note that just because something is hagiographical doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
Right. It's
still, I mean, we believe in the resurrection.
Yes, amen. Yeah.
That is the most, quote, hagiographical thing. I mean, it's
fantastic.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, but we believe it, and we know that it is a historical certainty. It's a historical reality, and if we believe that, then why can't we believe that Saint Patrick identified a drop of poison that was in his cup, froze the liquid, all except for the poison, and the poison dropped out, and he was able to unfreeze the liquid and drink with no side effects.
Sure.
That is a much less of a miracle, at least in my opinion, as the resurrection of Jesus himself.
Right, sure.
So just because something is
There's
hagiographical,
supernatural reality.
there's supernatural reality in Christianity. That's a fact. So we have to be careful in discounting the historicity of some of the hagiographical elements.
Right.
And so that's where there has been a lot of work in is identifying historical Patrick.
Interesting.
That's
so let's get into that.
a lot. There's been a lot of work in that.
So what do we know actually? What can we know about St. Patrick?
So we can know that he lived in the 5th century. So from about, most scholars believe 432 was when he arrived.
Okay.
So we have early documents of Palladius, actually. Some scholars think that Palladius is Patrick and that they're one and the same. And he was sent by the Pope to evangelize and to less evangelize, but to support the Christians who are already in Ireland. That's another mistake that people make, is that they assume that Patrick was the first one to introduce Christianity. Christianity had already been established. I mean, people traded all the time between the British Isles and Ireland. There was trade, there was commerce, and so Christianity had been introduced. There were Christians there. That's why the Pope sent Palladius.
Okay.
So we have that. So we know that there were Christians in there, and we know that Patrick wrote the confession. He wrote the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. So we have those firsthand documents, and so, but the best guess is that he operated in Ireland from about 432 to as late as 492-93. We have two different obituaries of him. One that there's a Patrick that dies in 464, and then one who dies in 492-93. And so the debate has been then which one is correct. That is not the concern of my research.
Sure.
That's not the concern of my research. So
But that's just kind of where things are.
That's kind of where things are. So we know that he operated sometime in the 5th century. Gotcha. We know that Christianity in Ireland flourished in the 5th century. We know from Patrick's own writings that he knew both the Vulgate,
the Latin
translation, which
of the Bible,
which Jerome would have written at the beginning of the 5th century. So we know it would have taken some time for that to disseminate to Ireland.
Right, to get all the way there.
But so he uses the Vulgate, but he also uses the old translations as well, of particularly the Old Testament.
Okay.
And so that tells us that it's a very good very, very good historical evidence that places him in the 5th century.
Okay.
No earlier than that. And Ireland became thoroughly Christian within the 5th century into the 6th and 7th, where my author lives. My author lives in a time where it is Christian, but there are still pagan elements as well.
Right.
Paganism still was very widespread during that time, just like it is today. Sure. Really,
you could say you're in a Christian country.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so let's back up. So what is it that we miss about what is not true about St. Patrick?
Okay,
let's get to this. We kind of know about what did he? Probably a leader in his church. Probably was illiterate. Probably able to communicate and serve to bring Christianity into more prominence in that region. But what do we miss about him? What's wrong?
Some of the myths. Okay, so there's this myth that he used a clover
Yes.
to
Hence, everything is green today.
the green thing that he used the clover to explain the Trinity. There is no evidence for that.
Okay.
There is no early evidence that he did that. That would be actually heretical. He was trained. My author says that he went to Spain to train. His own account is kind of gray in that area. There's not a whole lot that he himself gives of his training, but tradition states that he trained in Gaul. He was actually on his way to Rome to be trained when he met somebody in Gaul and said, "This person is amazing." And so he sat at his feet and learned, some say 30 years, some say 40 years before he went to Ireland to be a missionary.
Gotcha.
So we know that he was thoroughly orthodox.
Okay.
We know that he knew heresy. He knew about Pelagius. He knew the Pelagian heresy. And so we can, it's pretty unlikely that he would have used a clover to teach on the Trinity.
Okay.
I mean, it's modalism. It's a form of modalism, and he would have known that.
Okay.
So probably didn't use that. The whole snakes, and have you heard this one? He drove out the snakes in Ireland.
Yes.
So that's one of those things that there were never snakes in Ireland.
Okay.
So let's try to explain this. Why aren't there any snakes? Well, St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, he drove them out. There were none to begin with. That's just that's a myth. That's a complete myth. So the idea of getting totally drunk on St. Patrick's Day, I mean, they had different views of alcohol. Obviously, they drank beer. They brewed beer. But probably he's not going to get wasted. He's probably a little bit more temperate than that. It's interesting because he places himself, and we know this from his confession, within the ascetic tradition. So we don't know if he actually took monastic vows.
Okay.
When I say ascetic tradition, I mean kind of the monastic tradition. We don't know if he took monastic vows, but we do know that he saw himself within that tradition. So there are elements within his confession that place him within that. So the idea of solitude, he has a wandering in the desert, very reminiscent of the Desert Fathers. People like Saint Anthony, Martin, yes, all of those Desert Fathers.
Okay, so could you just go back and give me like a real quick bullet point of like kind of what we know? We'll go back to the myths of what we know of his life, because wasn't there something like he is kidnapped? Just hit those.
Yeah. So he states in his confession that he was at 16 years old. He was kidnapped with he says thousands upon thousands of others and taken to Ireland. So he is actually captive in Ireland. So he works as a shepherd.
Okay.
The Mosaic ties, right? So he works as a shepherd for 6 years. He's a slave until that is where he's converted.
Okay.
So he admits that his grandfather was a priest. His father was a deacon. But he himself admits that he did not fear God.
Interesting.
He was nominal at best. He knew about the faith, but it wasn't until his captivity that God got a hold of his heart. And he says that it awoke something in him, that he would pray constantly. He says 100 times a day and 100 times at night. Again, within that,
he felt his heart strangely warm.
He felt his heart strangely warm. And so during this time, he heard from God, and he said, go, be free. Your ship is ready. It's a long ways away. It's about 200 miles. Now, that's not 200 miles as the bird flies. It's probably winding away, but it's 200 miles away. And so he goes and he walks, and he doesn't know where he's going or what he's supposed to do. He knows the boat has been made ready. And so he goes, eventually finds himself at the sea, and there's a group of pagans. And he says, "Can I come with you?" And they agree. They take him on. Now, he's very careful about not associating himself with pagans. And so he says he refused to be that close closely akin to them. There was a aspect of, if we're going to take you on, you become one of us.
Yeah.
And he says, no, I'm not one of you.
Okay.
And so there's that distinction. And so he boards the ship, and this is from his confession. So he boards the ship. He sets sail. He eventually gets to a place where he goes through a desert for 28 days, and he leads the people, leads his group of pagans that he's with through the desert, and he provides them food, a miraculous event. And he writes us that they were starving, they were grumbling, and so he prayed that he was fasting at this time. He was told to fast. God told him to fast, and so he prays and provides this food for them.
Manna in
He
the
does not
wilderness.
manna in the wilderness, and so he does not partake because it had been sacrificed to pagan gods. So he's still fasting. During the night, he's attacked spiritually to the point where he could not move. He was immobile, and he cries out for help, and he says, I firmly believe that the Lord met me there, and I said there was darkness all around, and I saw the light come and expel the darkness.
Interesting.
And so he's saved from this. He eventually
Another mosaic theme.
He eventually comes home, and that's where the confession kind of stops as far as the autobiography. And so he goes home. He hears what is called the voice of the Irish. A man named Victorious appears to him and is carrying letters. Says, these are the voice of the Irish begging you to return, begging you to come back as a missionary. And so from that point, he then goes back. My author takes him to Gaul, and it's a whole big thing. But as far as what we know from his confession, he then goes back. It's interesting because even to this day, that phrase, voice of the Irish, is still on stamps, Irish stamps. It's in Latin, but it says voice of the Irish right there.
Interesting.
And so it's embedded into the culture, into the Irish culture. So I think that's really interesting. So we know that he was extremely pious. We know that he was a man of prayer. He describes in his confession that as he's agonizing over the state of the spiritual state of Ireland, he's agonizing. He says he doesn't even know what to pray, but the Spirit was at work in him, praying on his behalf.
Wow.
And so we know that he was a man of prayer. We know that he had an impactful ministry in Ireland. The reason he writes his confession is because people question it. People were questioning what God was doing through him. And so he says, listen, this is what the Lord has been doing. We know that he had resistance within the church. Maybe it was jealousy.
Yeah.
Maybe there was some politics going on, which is most likely, trying to delegitimize his ministry.
Yeah.
So we know that there was resistance to his ministry, and so he was a man of prayer, but he was also a man of conviction.
Yeah.
He saw monastic vows as a very positive thing. He valued human life. This is one of the first instances that we have of someone speaking out to the slave trade.
Wow.
In his letters to the soldiers of Herodotus, he's basically saying, "What are you doing, making captive Christians?
Right.
What's going on here? We're all Christians here. We can't be taking other Christians captive." So he was very early on against the practice of slavery, at least Christians.
Right,
enslaving
and
Christians.
like you said, and maybe didn't have the distinctions that we would have at this point.
No,
but
we
yet,
wouldn't.
There's something that's not right. There's something not right morally going on.
He
in this
identifies
situation.
there's something morally not right, and so he speaks out against it.
Yeah.
And the later tradition says that Herodotus himself was transformed into a fox and is never seen again. So yeah, he speaks out against it, and Herodotus basically says, "I don't care. I'm still going to do it," and he's transformed into a fox. So that's kind of a fun story.
So let's see if we can what are like the two things. I'm going to push you to get two things that we should reasons why we should honor this legacy of St. Patrick. for our time.
Reasons why we should honor St. Patrick's legacy. He did, even just for the work that he did in Ireland. Like he is, I won't say solely responsible, because I think that would be a little too much. But that would be a little hagiographical. But he is, in a large part, responsible for the Christian nation of Ireland. He was a powerful missionary. And he's an example of someone that we can look up to. One, he stood up for what was right, what he thought was moral. He stood up for his ministry, what God was doing in Ireland, what God was doing through him, and he gives all the credit to God. He does not say it's me or my programs or my preaching or anything. He says this is what God's been doing.
Yeah.
And so his missionary work is something that we need to celebrate.
Yeah.
We need to celebrate that. And I think his humility and piety is something that a lot of church leaders can learn from. Because it's not about a program. It's not about a personality.
Developing a platform.
It's not about developing a platform or anything like that. He is constantly deflecting off of himself and onto the work that God is doing through him.
Yeah.
And that is a leadership lesson that we can take. He spent he never saw himself as Irish. But there is recognition that he is here for the long haul, and he is here till death.
Wow.
He never saw himself as going back.
Wow.
Burned
the ship, so to speak.
He basically burned the ships.
So there is some of the famous sayings from the Confessions. Like, what are some of those?
So probably his most famous saying is falsely attributed to him. Sadly, it's like the William Booth. It's he would probably have said it, but his the prayer that is written on the St. Patrick's breastplate. It's very, very famous. Christ before me, Christ in me, Christ when I rise, Christ when I lie down. That whole prayer.
That's
very, very famous. It is a prayer that is modeled after the armor of God. It's a prayer of protection, and we see that theme throughout Patrick's life. God had divinely protected him in multiple instances, and so that's his most famous, I guess, saying. But did he say it? Did he not? He actually has this really interesting phrase that he says, "Only God knows."
Yeah, sure.
Only God knows. But so as far as like the sayings go, it's hard to identify one or two because
but
we
that
just don't know.
statement is something that we could that still is in the spirit of him. Like,
absolutely.
Certainly, like it's something as you're working with your kids and you talk about your kids, like why are we wearing green today? Or what? Well, let's think about who St. Patrick is. We point back to his historical figure. The prayer of St. Patrick is a beautiful prayer to bring up on St. Patrick's Day.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. It's a beautiful prayer. It is within the patrician spirit. It's something that we Christians should know. It's one of those prayers. Dr. Friedemann here, a professor here at Wesley Biblical Seminary, he has this discipleship, an age 18 list that he calls it, and he goes through and this age 18 list, and one of the things that he does is the mealtime. Mealtimes are very, very important to him. And so one of the things that they would do is memorize famous prayers.
Yeah.
And so I love that idea of memorizing famous prayers, and this should be on the list of those famous prayers. If it's not, it should be on the list of every single person who prays the prayers of the saints, and we should know.
Yeah, it's good to some people that in their traditions, it's not something really. Prayers are always spontaneous or extemporaneous, but there is some real power in taking somebody else's words and praying them yourself, praying the Psalms. Maybe people do that, but taking St. Patrick's this prayer in the tradition of St. Patrick and praying it, that would be a great thing.
It'd be a fantastic thing. And I think going back to spontaneous prayer, I think that's in a large part why people are they don't pray in public or they don't know what to pray.
Right.
And so there's been this stigma of, well, if I don't know what to pray, I'm just kind of not going to pray it. But if we destigmatize scripted prayers in our evangelical circles, I think that would transform the prayer life of many, many people of just saying it's okay if you don't know what to pray. It's okay to take a prayer from Scripture or a prayer from one of the saints and make that your own.
Yeah, sure.
Make those words your own. Pray them as if you were praying them for the very first time.
Yeah.
And when you do that, it transforms the way you pray.
So if you look in the show notes, I'll make sure to put it in there. We'll have a copy. We'll have a link to, or no, I'll probably just put in the show notes that has the St. Patrick prayer there, something that you could use. Maybe we could even come up with a way like we could share it in a kind of a printable way or something that's more attractive. We could put that in there, put a link in there. Yeah. So yeah, that's great. Oh, I love that emphasis. Anything else that you wanted to say about St. Patrick? I know you have go see a 400-page dissertation.
Yeah, I have a whole dissertation of, well, not a whole dissertation yet. I'm still working on it. I tell people I think I'm halfway through. I'm not entirely sure, but.
Anything else you wanted to say?
Anything else I want to say? I mean, there's so much to say about St. Patrick, but the thing that I always highlight is that he was a man of humility. He was a man of prayer. He was a man who stood up when God called him to.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, he
responded to that call to go back to Ireland.
He responded to the call to go back to the people who enslaved him.
Wow.
The first thing that he does, again, this is my author. My author, the first thing he does is not go directly to the king of Ireland. He goes up to where he was taken captive in the hopes that he could repay and buy his freedom.
Wow.
Because he wants to start his ministry from a place of freedom.
Yeah.
And so he says, I ran away.
Right. He did the wrong thing.
He did the wrong thing.
Yeah,
he did the wrong thing.
Left slavery.
He left his master. And so he wants to go and buy his freedom.
Right.
So that he can start his ministry from the moral place is how he would have seen it. This is the moral thing to do. And he goes there, and his former master says, I see this Patrick coming. I don't want to bow. I know if he comes to me, I'm going to have to bow my knee to him. And so he decides, instead of bowing my knee to Patrick, I'm going to burn myself and my wealth.
Oh, my.
And so he takes everything that he owns and puts it in his house and sets it on fire. So Patrick sees this from afar and says, God knows. That's his response. Only God knows. And so he turns away. And the first convert happens right then. He meets when he first arrives, he meets this good man, and he converts to the faith right away.
Wow.
And so it's within that context that the first convert is set. So it's really, really interesting. But he was a man who,
maybe just because, kind of like the assumption there is his obedience.
Yeah.
Like that he went back to do what he's supposed to do. And after he took that obedient action, that's when the fruit started to come.
Absolutely. Yeah. He was obedient to what God called him to do. And that could not have been an easy task. Yeah. I mean, this was pagan territory. This was outside of Christendom. I mean, so we have, the Great Commission, right? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. This was the end of the earth.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
There was an eschatological view that he himself had. He was ushering in the end days because this was the end of the earth. There was nowhere else to go.
There's nowhere else to go. Like, you're at the last place.
You're at the last place. And so Patrick himself saw that this was fulfilling the Great Commission. He was fulfilling Scripture here.
Yeah.
And so that a lot of people took issue with that too.
Sure.
A lot of people took issue with that. But he saw himself as being that ends of the earth missionary.
Right.
That had to take courage. That had to take something special within himself to say, this is outside the kingdom.
Yeah.
This is outside the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God has not expanded this far yet. We're going into uncharted territory.
Yeah, man, it's powerful. It's being an end of the earth Christian. I like that. I've never even heard that term, like, to describe it that way. Well, I think this is great. Jeff, thank you so much for taking time
Absolutely.
to talk through this. I know it's like just, it's all around you right now. You're just thinking about it through the, and also this is a unique approach too, going back and looking at the way the hagiography happened, but also what this tells us and how this can inspire us. So thank you for taking time
Absolutely.
from a scholarly side to do it, but also to kind of bring it down to this level for us
Absolutely,
today.
and that's my goal at the end of this project. You do the scholarly work so that, at least in my view, I'm doing the scholarly work so that I can say, okay, why is this important?
Yeah,
why
absolutely.
should we study the lives of the saints? Why should the people in the pew, the pastors who are preaching, why should we care about these things? The hagiography doesn't need to be scary.
Yeah.
There is a grand tradition of the communion of saints that we miss in our
Yeah,
evangelical
sure, yeah.
circles. And so if we can say these are holy people that are steadfast in the faith, that are courageous in the faith, and who are imitating Jesus himself. And so I want to imitate Jesus, I want to imitate
Right.
Patrick. I want to imitate. That's what Paul says.
I
Paul
like how
says,
you brought up the communion of saints. Like that's part of what we're talking about here. And last week
Yeah.
I just taught a class in Mexico on ecclesiology. So again, this is a part of what we affirm in the Apostles' Creed. I believe forgive the sins, the communion of saints. Like this is a part of the call. Like a part of being a Christian is celebrating and looking what God has done in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ.
Yeah.
So that is what we're doing when we look at these historical figures.
Yeah.
We're looking at them through the lens of what God has done in their lives,
Yeah.
in order that we too can follow in their footsteps, that we can follow faithfully, that we can take the kingdom to uncharted territory.
Right. That's right. Being into the earth Christian.
Absolutely.
Jeff, thanks so much.
Absolutely.
It's great. Thank you all for coming along to the More to the Story podcast. Check this out. Share a link to this, particularly today when it comes out on St. Patrick's Day. It might get people's attention because they might not know what it is. They might be curious why people are wearing green, but we hope they get caught into this message,
Yes.
the big picture of what God's doing in the world and how he's inviting them into it, just like that's what St. Patrick did. I mean, this
Absolutely.
is an evangelist. So we're
Yeah.
celebrating an evangelist
Yep.
today and God's call and God's work in his life. So thanks, Jeff, for coming along.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
God bless you all.